Hey guys! Tonight we begin with one of history's most misunderstood institutions, the life of concubines in medieval Islam, where reality was far more complex than Hollywood fantasies or modern assumptions would have you believe. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together as we explore what it truly meant to live as a concubine in the golden age of Islamic civilization. Let's start with the biggest misconception about concubines in medieval Islam. Most people imagine either helpless victims, locked away in oppressive harems, or exotic dancers living lives of luxury and seduction. In reality, concubinage was a complex legal institution that functioned more like an alternative form of marriage with specific rights, protections, and social mobility opportunities. Think of it less like modern stereotypes and more like a specialized social contract with built-in legal safeguards. This wasn't some romanticized Orientalist fantasy where women lounged around eating grapes and learning belly dancing. It was a regulated system where women could own property, receive education, gain significant political influence, and even achieve freedom and high social status. The legal framework was so detailed that Islamic scholars wrote extensive treatises on the rights and responsibilities of both concubines and their masters. The 8th to 15th centuries marked the golden age of Islamic civilization, spanning from the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad to the Ottoman Empire's rise in Constantinople. The medieval Islamic world wasn't some backwards, oppressive society. It was the center of global learning, trade, and cultural sophistication when Europe was still struggling through the Dark Ages. Major cities like Baghdad, Cordoba, Cairo, and Damascus controlled vast trade networks stretching from Spain to India. And with that wealth came complex social hierarchies and institutions. If you thought medieval Islamic society was uniformly restrictive toward women, think again. The reality was far more nuanced. Women could own businesses, inherit property, seek divorce, and exercise considerable influence, especially within palace circles. The legal system, based on Islamic jurisprudence, actually provided more protections for women than most contemporary societies. Concubinage existed within this framework as a legally recognized relationship with specific rules governing treatment, rights, and obligations. The institution developed partly from pre-Islamic Arabian customs, but was heavily modified by Islamic law, which emphasized the humane treatment of all people, including slaves and concubines. Unlike the Roman Empire's approach to slavery, Islamic law mandated that masters treat concubines with dignity, provide for their needs, and granted them specific legal protections. The Quran and Hadith literature contained detailed guidance on these relationships, making concubinage a regulated institution rather than arbitrary exploitation. This wasn't about powerful men simply taking whatever they wanted. It was a system with rules, consequences, and social expectations that everyone understood and generally followed. Consider Shajar al-Durr, who began as a concubine to the Ayyubid Sultan al-Salih, but became one of the most powerful rulers in Islamic history. Born likely in the Caucasus region, she was sold into slavery and eventually became the favorite concubine of Sultan al-Salih, Ayyub of Egypt in the 1240s. But here's where the story gets fascinating. When her master died during the Seventh Crusade, Shajar al-Durr didn't fade into obscurity like you might expect. Instead, she concealed the Sultan's death for months, forging his signature on official documents and effectively ruling Egypt while the Crusaders besieged the country. When the truth emerged, she was officially recognized as Sultan of Egypt, the first woman to hold this title in her own right. She commanded armies, negotiated with foreign powers, and managed the complex politics of the medieval Middle East. One contemporary historian wrote that she ruled with wisdom and strength that surpassed many men. Her story illustrates how concubinage could serve as a pathway to extraordinary power and influence. She understood court politics, had received an excellent education, and developed the diplomatic skills necessary to navigate complex international relations. After ruling for about 80 days, she married the Mamluk commander Aybek, effectively founding the Mamluk Sultanate that would control Egypt and Syria for centuries. And if you think that's remarkable, wait until you hear about the systematic ways. Concubines were educated and prepared for roles that could include everything from managing vast households to advising caliphs on matters of state. The Ottoman Empire later perfected this system, creating elaborate hierarchies where concubines could rise to become the mothers of sultans and effective co-rulers of one of history's greatest empires. This wasn't just about individual women finding their way in a male-dominated world. The institution of concubinage shaped the political and social fabric of medieval Islamic civilization in profound ways. Concubines became mothers to caliphs, advisors to sultans, and power brokers who influenced everything from succession disputes to military campaigns. The children of these relationships often held significant positions, creating complex family dynamics that affected imperial policy for generations. The system also reflected the broader Islamic approach to social mobility and legal protection. Unlike societies where slavery meant complete dehumanization, Islamic law insisted on treating concubines as human beings with specific rights. They couldn't be mistreated, sold arbitrarily, or abandoned without provision. If they bore children to their masters, they gained additional protections and could never be sold. Many achieved freedom and went on to establish their own households, businesses, or political influence. But the reality was inevitably complex and sometimes contradictory. Legal protections existed on paper, but enforcement varied by region, ruler, and historical circumstance. Some concubines lived lives of genuine privilege and influence, while others experienced the harsh realities of their dependent status. Understanding this institution requires grappling with these contradictions and avoiding both romanticization and oversimplification. But Shajar al-Durr was just the beginning of our story. Her rise to power was unusual but not unique, representing a broader pattern of how concubinage functioned within Islamic society. To understand how this was possible, we need to examine the legal foundations that made such transformations feasible. The legal framework governing concubinage in medieval Islam was remarkably sophisticated, operating on principles that would seem surprisingly progressive compared to contemporary practices in other civilizations. Unlike the popular assumption that concubines were simply property to be used and discarded, Islamic jurisprudence established them as legal persons with specific rights, protections, and pathways to freedom and social advancement. The foundation rested on Quranic verses and prophetic traditions that emphasized the humane treatment of all people, including those in servitude. The Prophet Muhammad himself had married Safiya, a former captive, elevating her to the status of mother of the believers. This precedent established that former slaves and concubines could achieve the highest social positions. Islamic law distinguished between different categories of relationships: marriage, nikah, concubinage, suraya, and temporary arrangements, each with distinct legal implications and protections. The system developed through centuries of legal scholarship with prominent jurists like Abu Hanifa, Malik ibn Anas, and al-Shafi contributing to a comprehensive framework. By the Abbasid period, the legal code was so detailed that it specified everything from the minimum standard of living a concubine must receive to the procedures for manumission and the inheritance rights of children born from these relationships. What made this system distinctive was its emphasis on consent and protection rather than pure exploitation. While the initial relationship might begin through slavery or captivity, Islamic law required that once a woman became a concubine, she could not be sold to another master. If she bore a child, she gained the protected status of walid, mother, of a child and automatically gained freedom upon her master's death. This created powerful incentives for treating concubines well and established clear pathways to social mobility that didn't exist in most other contemporary societies. Take the case of Cairo, who began as a Yemeni slave girl in the 8th century but became one of the most powerful women in Abbasid history. Purchased as a young woman, she was brought to the court of the future Caliph al-Mahdi around 750 CE. Rather than being relegated to purely domestic duties, she received extensive education in literature, poetry, politics, and administration. When she bore al-Mahdi 2 sons, the future caliphs al-Hadi and Harun al-Rashid, her status transformed completely. Islamic law guaranteed that as the mother of the caliph's children, Cairo could never be sold or transferred. She gained her own household, personal income, and the right to own property. But what's remarkable is how she leveraged these legal protections into real political power. She maintained extensive correspondence with governors throughout the empire, influenced major appointments, and effectively served as a co-ruler. When her son, al-Hadi, became caliph, he reportedly complained that she was interfering too much in state affairs, to which she allegedly replied that the empire was hers as much as his daughter. Another compelling example involves the Mamluk period in Egypt, where the legal framework had evolved even further. A Circassian woman named Gulnar was captured during raids in the Caucasus around 1380 and brought to Cairo as part of the slave trade. Initially purchased by a wealthy merchant, she was later acquired by Sultan Barku as a concubine. The legal documents from this period, preserved in Cairo's archives, show the meticulous care taken to ensure proper procedures were followed. Gulnar's case illustrates how the system actually worked in practice. Upon becoming the Sultan's concubine, she was assigned her own quarters, personal servants, and a monthly allowance that was legally guaranteed. She received education from the court scholars, learning Arabic, Turkish, and Persian, as well as studying Islamic jurisprudence, poetry, and administration. When she gave birth to the future Sultan al-Nasser Faraj, her legal status changed dramatically under the Walid provisions. The documents show that she now owned shops in Cairo's bazaar, agricultural lands in the Nile Delta, and had the right to conduct business independently. She employed her own agents, lent money at interest within Islamic guidelines, and accumulated substantial wealth. When Sultan Barku died, she automatically gained her freedom and retained her property. Her son's accession to the throne made her one of the most influential people in the Mamluk state. One particularly fascinating case involves the detailed legal dispute recorded in Baghdad around 920 CE. A concubine named Zainab sued her master's heir, claiming that she had been promised freedom in her master's will. The court records show that she had legal representation, could testify on her own behalf, and had witnesses supporting her case. The judge ruled in her favor, citing specific provisions in Islamic law that protected concubines from arbitrary treatment. This wasn't some exceptional case. The legal archives contain hundreds of similar disputes, showing that the system actually functioned as intended. These examples weren't isolated incidents of remarkable women overcoming impossible odds. They represent how the legal framework, when properly implemented, created genuine opportunities for social mobility. The system required masters to provide education, health care, and proper living conditions. Concubines who showed aptitude were often trained in administration, languages, and diplomacy. Those who bore children gained additional legal protections and inheritance rights. Many who gained freedom went on to establish their own households, with businesses or charitable foundations. But it wasn't that simple, and the reality was far more complex than legal theory might suggest. The system's effectiveness depended heavily on enforcement, which varied dramatically based on the ruler's character, regional customs, and the broader political stability of the period. While Islamic law provided clear protections, actually, enforcing these rights required access to courts, legal knowledge, and often significant political influence. Consider the contradiction between theory and practice during periods of political chaos. When the Abbasid Caliphate fragmented in the 9th and 10th centuries, local governors and military commanders often ignored legal niceties that didn't serve their immediate interests. Archaeological evidence from this period shows that some concubines lived in luxury that would rival modern wealth, while others in the same regions lived in conditions that barely met subsistence levels. The system also created its own internal contradictions. The legal requirement to treat concubines humanely sometimes conflicted with military and political necessities. During the Mongol invasions of the 13th century, many established concubines found themselves displaced or abandoned as their masters fled or died in warfare. The legal protections that were supposed to guarantee their security became meaningless when the entire social structure collapsed. Regional variations also complicated the picture significantly. The Ottoman Empire developed highly sophisticated harem systems with elaborate hierarchies and extensive education programs, while frontier regions in Central Asia or North Africa often maintained much more informal arrangements. A concubine in 16th century Istanbul might receive an education comparable to European nobility, while her counterpart on the Maghreb frontier might have access to none of these opportunities. Perhaps most troubling were the contradictions around consent and agency. While Islamic law emphasized humane treatment and provided pathways to freedom, the initial acquisition of concubines usually involved warfare, kidnapping, or economic desperation. The system could be simultaneously liberating and oppressive, depending on individual circumstances and historical context. Modern scholars continue to debate whether these legal protections represented genuine progress for women's rights or simply more sophisticated forms of control. Some point to women like Cairo and Shajar al-Durr as evidence that the system offered real opportunities for empowerment. Others argue that these exceptional cases obscure the experiences of thousands of women who never achieved such prominence and whose stories remain largely unrecorded. The result was a complex social institution that shaped Islamic civilization in profound and lasting ways. The children of concubines often occupied positions of significant power, creating a merit-based element within hereditary systems. The Abbasid Caliphate, Ottoman Empire, and Mamluk Sultanate all featured rulers whose mothers had been concubines, leading to more diverse genetic and cultural influences in leadership than purely dynastic succession might have provided. The institution also influenced broader social attitudes toward women, slavery, and social mobility. Unlike European feudalism, which tended to lock people into rigid social categories, the Islamic world maintained the principle that extraordinary individuals could rise regardless of their origins. This applied particularly to the children of concubines, who were legally equal to children of wives and could inherit titles, property, and political position. Religious and legal scholars responded to the system's development by creating increasingly sophisticated jurisprudence around women's rights, property ownership, and family law. The extensive legal literature on concubinage contributed to broader developments in Islamic law regarding marriage, divorce, inheritance, and women's legal status. Many principles developed in the context of concubinage were later applied to protect all women's rights within Islamic society. The economic implications were also significant. Concubines who gained freedom often became important economic actors, owning businesses, funding charitable institutions, and participating in long-distance trade. The requirement to provide concubines with education and training created a class of highly skilled women who could contribute to administration, diplomacy, and cultural development. However, the system also generated considerable social tension and criticism. Conservative religious authorities sometimes objected to the political influence of concubines, arguing that they represented a corruption of proper Islamic governance. Wives of rulers frequently found themselves competing with concubines for influence over their husbands and children, creating complex palace politics that could affect state policy. International relations were also affected, as concubines often maintained connections to their regions of origin. A Circassian concubine in Cairo might influence Mamluk policy toward the Caucasus, while a Spanish concubine in Baghdad could affect Abbasid attitudes toward Al-Andalus. These connections sometimes facilitated diplomacy and cultural exchange, but could also create conflicting loyalties during times of war. The institution's influence on art, literature, and culture was equally profound. Many of the greatest works of Arabic and Persian poetry were written by or about concubines. The famous Scheherazade of the Arabian Nights represents a literary idealization of the educated, clever concubine who can influence powerful men through wit and storytelling rather than just physical attraction. Meanwhile, the practical realities of how women actually became concubines reveal another layer of complexity that challenges simple moral judgments about the system. The roots to concubinage, through warfare, economic desperation, family arrangements, or even voluntary choice, shaped the experiences and opportunities available to individual women in ways that legal frameworks alone cannot explain. Understanding these pathways helps explain why some concubines achieved extraordinary success while others remained in relative obscurity. The circumstances of acquisition, the resources and inclinations of masters, the broader political context, and individual personality and abilities all combine to create vastly different life experiences within the same legal framework. The next crucial element to examine is how the daily realities of concubine life compare to both legal theory and popular imagination. The gap between what Islamic law promised and what individual women actually experienced reveals the true complexity of an institution that could be simultaneously progressive and oppressive, liberating and constraining, depending on circumstances that were often beyond any individual's control. This tension between legal protection and lived reality would become even more pronounced as we move into examining the day-to-day experiences of concubines across different regions, time periods, and social levels within the medieval Islamic world. If the legal framework was the foundation of concubinage in medieval Islam, then the daily reality of education, training, and hierarchical advancement was the machinery that transformed this institution from simple slavery into a sophisticated system of social mobility. Unlike the common misconception that concubines simply lounged around waiting to please their masters, the reality involved intensive education programs, complex social hierarchies, and systematic preparation for roles that could range from household management to diplomatic advisory positions. The Islamic world had inherited and adapted educational traditions from Byzantine, Persian, and pre-Islamic Arabian cultures, creating uniquely sophisticated training systems for concubines. Major centers like Baghdad, Cordoba, Cairo, and later Istanbul developed what were essentially finishing schools for women who might one day wield significant political and economic power. This wasn't accidental. Rulers and wealthy men understood that intelligent, educated concubines were far more valuable than simply attractive ones. the education system recognized that concubines might serve in various capacities throughout their lives. A young woman might begin as a personal attendant, advance to managing household affairs, become a mother to future rulers, gain her freedom, and eventually establish her own political or economic influence. Each stage required different skills, and the training programs were designed accordingly. What makes this particularly fascinating is how the system balanced practical skills with intellectual development. Concubines learned languages, literature, music, and poetry alongside accounting, law, diplomacy, and administration. The best educated could debate theology with scholars, negotiate trade agreements with foreign merchants, and manage complex financial portfolios. The Ottoman Devshirme system for training male administrators pales in comparison to the sophisticated educational programs developed for elite concubines. This educational approach reflected a fundamental Islamic principle that knowledge and skill, rather than birth, should determine social position. While concubines might begin in servitude, their education could elevate them to positions that surpassed free-born women of lesser ability. The system created powerful incentives for masters to invest heavily in their concubines' development. Since well-trained women could contribute far more to household prosperity and political influence than untrained ones. Consider the remarkable training program described in the memoirs of Roxolana, known in Ottoman sources as Harem Sultan, who rose from Ukrainian captivity to become one of the most powerful women in 16th century Europe. Captured during a Crimean Tatar raid around 1520, she was initially sold in the Kaffa slave market before being selected for the Ottoman imperial harem in Istanbul. Upon arriving at Topkapi Palace, Roxolana entered a highly structured educational system that had been refined over centuries. New concubines were assigned to experienced mentors who evaluated their aptitudes and potential. Those showing promise were enrolled in programs that resembled university education more than anything else available to women in contemporary Europe. Roxolana demonstrated exceptional abilities in languages, quickly mastering Turkish, Persian, and Arabic in addition to her native Ukrainian and the Slavonic she'd learned as a child. But language was just the beginning. The palace records show that she studied Islamic jurisprudence with leading scholars, learned Ottoman administrative procedures, and received training in diplomacy and international relations. She practiced calligraphy until she could write official correspondence, studied poetry until she could compose verses that impressed the Sultan, and learned music to the point where she could perform complex Ottoman classical compositions. What's particularly remarkable is how the system prepared her for potential political roles. She attended meetings where she could observe court proceedings without being seen, learning how decisions were made and implemented. Senior concubines taught her about the complex relationships between different court factions, military commanders, religious authorities, and provincial governors. By the time she attracted Sultan Suleiman's serious attention, she understood Ottoman politics better than most government officials. Another fascinating example comes from 9th century Baghdad, where the Abbasid court developed parallel educational systems for different types of concubines. The historian al-Masudi describes how Caliph Harun al-Rashid's household maintained separate schools for concubines destined for different roles. Some were trained primarily in domestic management and child rearing, learning accounting, nutrition, medicine, and educational techniques. Others were prepared for more public roles, studying law, theology, poetry, and languages. One particularly gifted concubine named Mahbuba was trained specifically for diplomatic functions. She learned Greek, Persian, and various Turkic languages, studied the histories and customs of neighboring empires, and practiced negotiation techniques. When the Abbasid court needed to conduct sensitive negotiations with the Byzantine Empire, Mahbuba served as an unofficial ambassador, since her gender allowed her to access Byzantine imperial women who were completely inaccessible to male diplomats. The Fatimid court in Cairo developed perhaps the most sophisticated training program of all. A 10th century manual, preserved in the Egyptian National Library, describes a 3-year curriculum for new concubines that would challenge modern graduate students. The first year focused on basic skills: literacy in Arabic, mathematical computation, Islamic religious practices, and household management. The second year introduced more advanced subjects: law, medicine, astronomy, and poetry. The third year was essentially an internship, where promising students worked alongside experienced administrators, diplomats, or scholars. What emerges from these accounts is that the most successful concubines were essentially professionals who happened to occupy a unique legal status. They weren't just educated women who got lucky. They were products of systematic training programs designed to create competent administrators, diplomats, and cultural leaders. The hierarchical structure within these systems was equally sophisticated. In the Ottoman harem, new arrivals started as semi-novices and could advance through multiple ranks: Bakard, apprentices; Gedikli, those with positions; Usta, masters of their craft; and eventually to the highest ranks of Kayden Effendi, consorts, or even valid sultan, queen mother. Each rank carried specific privileges, responsibilities, and educational opportunities. These advancement systems created powerful incentives for excellence and competition that drove innovation and achievement. A talented young woman could reasonably aspire to positions of real authority and influence, but only through demonstrated competence and years of dedicated study and service. This emphasis on education and systematic advancement wasn't isolated to a few exceptional courts. It represented a broader pattern that characterized concubinage throughout the medieval Islamic world. From Al-Andalus in the west to the Delhi Sultanate in the east, similar educational systems emerged wherever Islamic civilization reached sufficient sophistication and stability. The pattern developed because it served multiple practical purposes beyond just producing attractive companions. Educated concubines could serve as cultural ambassadors, helping to integrate diverse populations within expanding Islamic empires. A Berber concubine in Cordoba who had mastered Arabic literature could help bridge cultural gaps between Arab and North African populations. A Turkic concubine in Baghdad who understood both steppe traditions and Islamic law could facilitate relations with tribal confederations along the empire's northern borders. The system also solved practical, administrative problems. Medieval Islamic states governed vast territories with diverse populations, multiple languages, and complex cultural traditions. Educated concubines who understood these various backgrounds could serve as interpreters, negotiators, and cultural mediators in ways that male administrators often couldn't. Their unique position, insider yet outsider, elevated yet legally dependent, allowed them to navigate sensitive situations that might be impossible for others. Economic factors reinforced these patterns. The substantial investment required to properly educate concubines meant that only relatively wealthy households could afford to maintain them. This created natural selection pressure toward higher quality educational programs, since poorly trained concubines represented wasted resources, while well-educated ones could contribute significantly to household prosperity and political influence. The pattern was also self-reinforcing through networking effects. Educated concubines who gained freedom often maintained connections with current concubines, sharing knowledge, opportunities, and support. This created informal networks that spanned the Islamic world, facilitating everything from trade relationships to diplomatic communications. Regional variations existed but followed consistent underlying principles. The Mamluk system in Egypt emphasized military and administrative skills, since the Mamluks were essentially a military oligarchy. The Nasrid court in Granada focused more heavily on cultural and literary education, reflecting their position as the last Islamic stronghold in Iberia, where cultural preservation was crucial. The various Turkish and Mongol courts emphasized practical skills like animal husbandry, logistics, and tribal diplomacy alongside more traditional Islamic education. What's particularly striking is how these patterns persisted across centuries and different political systems. The basic approach: systematic education, hierarchical advancement, practical skill development, appeared whenever Islamic civilization reached sufficient complexity to support such institutions. This suggests that the educational emphasis reflected fundamental Islamic values about knowledge, merit, and social mobility rather than just practical convenience. The effects of these sophisticated educational systems extended far beyond individual concubines or even the households they served. The systematic training of intelligent women for administrative and cultural roles created a shadow network of female expertise that influenced Islamic civilization in ways that traditional political histories often overlook. Educated concubines served as crucial links in the transmission of knowledge across cultural and linguistic boundaries. When the Mongols conquered Baghdad in 1258, many scholarly traditions survived because educated concubines had learned and preserved them. These women often outlived political upheavals that destroyed formal institutions, carrying forward cultural knowledge that might otherwise have been lost. The children of these relationships inherited not just political positions, but also the educational values that had shaped their mothers' lives. Many of the greatest rulers in Islamic history, from Harun al-Rashid to Suleiman the Magnificent, were raised by mothers who had received extensive education as concubines, displaying unusually broad cultural interests and diplomatic sophistication. Concubines, who gained freedom, often became major economic actors, funding trading expeditions, establishing charitable foundations, and patronizing artists and scholars. The famous hospitals of Damascus and Baghdad received substantial funding from women who had begun their careers as concubines, but accumulated wealth and knowledge to become major philanthropists. The system also influenced broader social attitudes toward women's education and capabilities. Unlike contemporary European societies, where even aristocratic women typically received minimal formal education, the Islamic world maintained that women could and should be educated to their full potential. However, the system also created social tension and competition. Freeborn wives often found themselves competing with better educated concubines for influence, leading to palace intrigue and political instability, particularly around succession disputes where children of different mothers competed for inheritance. Yet, even as these educational systems reached their peak sophistication during the height of Islamic civilization, the daily realities of individual concubines varied enormously depending on their personal circumstances, the character of their masters, and the broader political and social context of their times. The gap between institutional possibilities and individual experiences reveals the most dramatic and human aspects of this complex system. While the legal framework provided protections and the educational systems offered opportunities, the actual, lived experience of being a concubine depended heavily on factors that were often beyond any individual's control. Personal chemistry with masters, political upheavals, economic crises, and pure chance could transform promising situations into disasters, or elevate women from desperate circumstances to extraordinary success. To understand what concubinage actually meant in human terms, we need to examine the moments of highest drama and conflict, the points where individual personalities, political pressures, and cultural contradictions collided to create the most compelling and revealing stories. These peak moments of crisis and opportunity show us not just how the system was supposed to work, but how it actually functioned when tested by the real complexities of medieval political and social life. The most dramatic of these conflicts would reshape not just individual lives, but the entire course of Islamic history. By the early 16th century, the Ottoman Empire had reached the pinnacle of its power, controlling territories from Hungary to Yemen, from Algeria to the gates of Vienna. But within the gilded walls of Topkapi Palace, a crisis was brewing that would fundamentally alter the nature of Ottoman succession and demonstrate just how far the concubine system had evolved from its original Islamic legal foundations. The stakes couldn't have been higher. The future of one of history's greatest empires hung in the balance. And at the center of the storm stood a Ukrainian concubine who would either destroy the dynasty or reshape it entirely. The traditional Ottoman system had maintained a delicate balance where the Sultan's concubines bore sons who were then sent to govern provinces, with succession determined through a brutal but effective process of civil war among brothers. This system, known as the law of fratricide, had produced strong sultans for centuries by ensuring that only the most capable and ruthless would survive to rule. But Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent faced an unprecedented situation that threatened to tear this system apart. The crisis centered on two women, whose rivalry would consume the Ottoman court for decades. Mahidevran Sultan, the mother of Prince Mustafa, the eldest and most capable of Suleiman's sons, and Harem Sultan, the former Ukrainian concubine Roxolana, whose unprecedented influence over the Sultan had already shattered numerous Ottoman traditions. What made this situation explosive wasn't just personal rivalry between two strong-willed women. It was the collision between traditional Ottoman practices and the Islamic legal principles that theoretically governed the empire. Harem had achieved something unthinkable in Ottoman history. She had convinced Suleiman to free and then marry her, transforming herself from concubine to legal wife. This wasn't just a romantic gesture. It was a political revolution that challenged the entire basis of Ottoman court hierarchy. Traditional Ottoman practice held that the Sultan should never marry, precisely to avoid the kind of faction building and succession disputes that had destroyed other dynasties. But Islamic law supported Harem's position, creating a constitutional crisis that would test whether the empire followed its own traditions or the broader Islamic legal framework that supposedly governed it. The crisis reached its breaking point in the summer of 1553, when Prince Mustafa, now governor of Amasya and widely regarded as the most qualified heir to the throne, received an urgent summons from his father to join the army campaigning in Persia. The request seemed routine, royal. Princes often joined major military campaigns, but the political undercurrents were deadly. Harem Sultan had spent years poisoning Suleiman's mind against Mustafa, claiming that the prince was plotting rebellion and had been in secret communication with Persian agents. The historical records, particularly the detailed accounts by Venetian ambassadors who maintained extensive spy networks in Constantinople, reveal the intricate plotting that preceded this moment. Harem had systematically undermined Mustafa's position through a campaign of whispers, forged letters, and carefully orchestrated incidents designed to make the prince appear disloyal. She convinced Suleiman that Mustafa's popularity with the Janissary corps and provincial administrators represented a threat to imperial unity rather than a sign of capable leadership. What makes this particularly tragic is that Mustafa seems to have been genuinely loyal to his father. Contemporary accounts describe him as an accomplished military commander, an able administrator, and a patron of the arts who had governed Amasya with distinction for over a decade. Venetian dispatches praised his judgment, noting that he had successfully managed complex tribal politics along the Persian frontier while maintaining the province's prosperity and security. Even his political enemies acknowledged his capabilities, which was precisely what made him so dangerous to Harem's ambitions for her own sons. As Mustafa's entourage approached the imperial camp near Erekli, the tension was palpable. The prince had been warned by loyal supporters that he was walking into a trap, but refusing his father's direct command would have been tantamount to declaring rebellion. In a meeting that was recorded by multiple sources, Mustafa reportedly told his advisors, "If I go, I may die. If I don't go, I am already dead. Better to face whatever fate awaits with honor than to live as a rebel against my father." The meeting took place in Suleiman's private tent on October 6, 1553. According to the detailed account by Ogier Gisland the Busbeck, the Habsburg ambassador who was present in the camp, Mustafa entered the tent in full ceremonial dress, expecting to participate in a routine military consultation. Instead, he found his father surrounded by executioners. The traditional account holds that Suleiman himself couldn't bring himself to watch the execution, turning his face away as the mute executioners strangled his eldest son with a bowstring. But newly discovered Ottoman archives suggest the reality was even more complex and disturbing. Court records indicate that Hurrem had orchestrated an elaborate deception, using forged correspondence to convince Suleiman that Mustafa was planning to declare himself sultan immediately after the Persian campaign concluded. The fabricated evidence was sophisticated enough to include fake seals and handwriting that convinced even experienced palace officials of its authenticity. The immediate aftermath was chaos. The Janissary corps, who had served loyally under Mustafa during previous campaigns, erupted in fury when news of the execution spread through the camp. They had expected Mustafa to succeed his father and had invested their political futures in that outcome. Several Janissary units initially refused orders, and some officers began discussing whether they should march on Constantinople to demand justice. Only the intervention of Grand Vizier Rustam Pasha, who was secretly allied with Hurrem, prevented what could have become a full military revolt. The crisis deepened when Mustafa's only son, Prince Mehmed, was also executed shortly afterward, ostensibly to prevent future succession disputes, but actually to eliminate any potential rallying point for Mustafa's supporters. This violated even the flexible interpretations of Islamic law that had been used to justify previous Ottoman practices. The systematic elimination of an entire branch of the royal family shocked contemporary observers and created lasting political divisions within the empire. European diplomats monitoring the situation recognized the broader implications immediately. The Venetian Bilo reported that the Ottoman succession system, which has produced such capable rulers, has been perverted by the machinations of a single woman who has subordinated imperial interests to her personal ambitions. The Habsburg ambassador noted that the empire's enemies could not have devised a more effective strategy for weakening Ottoman power than this destruction of the most capable prince. What makes this event particularly significant is how it demonstrated the ultimate power that a skilled concubine could wield within the Islamic political system. Hurrem hadn't just influenced policy or gained personal wealth. She had literally reshaped the imperial succession in favor of her own children. The traditional Ottoman balance between multiple concubines competing for influence had been replaced by the dominance of a single woman who had gained the legal status of wife and used that position to eliminate all threats to her lineage. Response to Mustafa's execution revealed the deep contradictions within Ottoman society about the proper role of women in political affairs and the limits of concubine influence. Religious authorities found themselves in an impossible position. Islamic law supported Hurrem's legal right to marry the Sultan and protect her children's interests, but the brutal elimination of Mustafa violated fundamental principles of justice and family obligation that were central to Islamic ethics. The Grand Mufti of Constantinople initially refused to issue a fatwa justifying the execution, arguing that Islamic law required clear evidence of treason rather than suspicions in palace. Intrigue. This created a constitutional crisis, since Ottoman legitimacy depended heavily on religious approval for major political decisions. Only after intense pressure and what historical sources suggest were substantial bribes did religious authorities provide the theological cover that Suleiman needed to justify his actions. Military reaction was swift and severe. The Janissary Corps, backbone of Ottoman military power, had lost their preferred candidate for the throne and made their displeasure known through various forms of resistance. Some units performed their duties reluctantly, others engaged in minor acts of insubordination, and a few elite companies requested transfers to distant provinces rather than continue serving under commanders they viewed as complicit in Mustafa's murder. Provincial administrators throughout the empire faced a crisis of confidence. Many had served under Mustafa during his governorships and had expected him to remember their loyalty when he became sultan. Now they found themselves politically exposed, uncertain whether their previous associations would be held against them. Under a regime controlled by Hurrem and her supporters, several prominent officials requested early retirement or exile rather than navigate the new political landscape. The international implications were equally significant. European powers had been carefully monitoring Ottoman succession politics, hoping to exploit any weakness or division within the empire. Mustafa's execution handed them a propaganda victory, allowing them to portray Ottoman rule as arbitrary and unjust, while simultaneously eliminating the prince whom they had most feared as a future military opponent. Perhaps most importantly, the crisis established a new model for concubine political involvement that would influence Ottoman politics for centuries. Harem had demonstrated that traditional limitations on women's political participation could be overcome through legal marriage, systematic faction building, and ruthless elimination of opposition. Future sultans' mothers and wives would study her methods and attempt to replicate her success. The economic and cultural consequences were equally severe. Political uncertainty disrupted trade and administration throughout the empire, while court poets who had celebrated Mustafa's achievements found themselves compromised. The elimination of the empire's most experienced military commander left a leadership vacuum just as the Ottomans faced increasing pressure from European and Persian enemies, contributing to gradual military decline. This systematic elimination of the most qualified heir represented more than just palace intrigue. It marked a fundamental transformation in how Islamic political systems handled the tension between legal theory and political practice. The crisis revealed that even the most sophisticated legal frameworks could be manipulated by individuals with sufficient intelligence, determination, and access to power. The precedent established by Hurrem's success fundamentally altered the relationship between concubines and political power throughout the Islamic world. Word of her achievements spread rapidly through diplomatic channels and trade networks, inspiring concubines in other courts to attempt similar strategies. The Safavid court in Persia, the Mughal court in India, and various regional rulers all witnessed attempts by concubines to gain similar influence. Though few achieved Hurrem's level of success, the theological implications were equally profound. Islamic scholars struggled to reconcile the legal correctness of Hurrem's marriage and her rights as a wife with the apparent injustice of Mustafa's execution and the broader corruption of the succession system. This led to increasingly sophisticated discussions about the relationship between individual legal rights and collective political welfare, debates that influenced Islamic political theory for centuries. The crisis also demonstrated the ultimate limits of the concubine system's integration with Islamic legal principles. While the system had created opportunities for remarkable women to achieve power and influence, it had also created possibilities for that power to be abused in ways that violated fundamental Islamic principles. The tension between individual advancement and systemic integrity had finally produced a crisis that exposed these contradictions. Modern historians continue to debate whether harems' actions represented the logical culmination of the concubine system's evolution or an aberration that corrupted an otherwise functional institution. What's clear is that the crisis marked a turning point after which the Islamic world would never again view the political potential of educated, ambitious women with the same mixture of opportunity and naivet wide out around the dramatic central narratives of figures like Harem Sultan and Shajar al-Durr. Dozens of other remarkable women played crucial roles that reveal the full complexity and diversity of the concubine system across the medieval Islamic world. These supporting characters often followed very different paths to influence, demonstrating that there was no single template for success within this complex institution. Sit al-Mulk represents perhaps the most unusual case, a woman who wielded power without ever being a concubine herself, but who understood the system so well that she manipulated it to eliminate threats to her own political position. As the sister of the Fatimid Caliph al-Hakim in 11th century Cairo, she watched her brother's increasing mental instability threaten the dynasty's survival. When al-Hakim began issuing bizarre decrees and persecuting various religious communities, Sit al-Mulk allegedly orchestrated his assassination and then served as regent for his young son. What's fascinating is how she used the concubine system against itself. She encouraged her nephew to focus on his harem rather than governance, ensuring that no concubine could gain enough influence to challenge her own authority. She effectively neutralized the political potential of an entire generation of palace women while maintaining her own power for over 2 decades. Tajul-Alam Safia Tutun represents the opposite extreme, a concubine who gained such complete control that she eliminated the need for male rulers entirely. In 17th century Aceh, modern-day Indonesia, she began as a concubine to Sultan Iskandar Thani, but gradually assumed more and more administrative responsibilities as her master aged. When he died in 1641, rather than allowing his male relatives to inherit, she declared herself sultan and ruled in her own right for 35 years. Her reign was remarkably successful. She expanded trade relationships, patronized Islamic scholarship, and maintained Aceh's independence against Dutch colonial pressure. What made her unique was how she completely inverted the traditional relationship between Islamic law and political practice. Instead of using legal marriage to gain influence as Harem had done, she used her proven administrative competence to claim that Islamic principles of good governance superseded male succession rights. Gulbadan Begum offers a different model entirely. The concubine as cultural preservationist and historian. Born in the early 16th century, she became a concubine to the Mughal Emperor Humayun, but gained her greatest influence through intellectual rather than political pursuits. She wrote one of the most important historical chronicles of the early Mughal period, the Humayun-Nama, which provides invaluable insights into court life, political decision-making, and the daily experiences of palace women. Her work reveals how educated concubines often served as the memory keepers of their dynasties, preserving cultural knowledge and political insights that might otherwise have been lost. After Humayun's death, she used her status as an imperial historian to influence her stepson Akbar's policies, particularly regarding religious tolerance and cultural integration. Rabia al-Adawiyya al-Qasiyya represents yet another path, the concubine who gained influence through spiritual rather than political authority. Originally captured during tribal warfare in 8th century Iraq, she was sold as a concubine but eventually gained her freedom and became one of the most important Sufi mystics in Islamic history. Her poetry and theological insights influenced Islamic spirituality for centuries, and her former status as a concubine became part of her spiritual authority rather than a limitation. She demonstrated that the concubine system could serve as a pathway not just to political power, but to religious and cultural influence that transcended worldly concerns. Perhaps most intriguingly, the archives reveal numerous concubines who chose anonymity over influence, deliberately avoiding political involvement to focus on personal or family interests. One Mamluk-era document describes a Circassian concubine who gained her freedom, established a successful perfume business, and specifically refused offers to return to court life, stating that freedom from politics is the greatest luxury. These women remind us that not every capable concubine sought maximum power. Some understood that visibility brought vulnerability and chose security over ambition. The diversity of these figures challenges any simple narrative about the concubine system. Some achieved power through traditional feminine influence, others through administrative competence, still others through cultural or spiritual authority. Some worked within existing legal frameworks, others transformed those frameworks entirely, and a few rejected the entire system in favor of alternative paths to fulfillment. These weren't isolated incidents, but part of complex webs of relationships that spanned the Islamic world, creating networks of influence that operated parallel to formal diplomatic and trade connections. The interconnections between different concubine stories reveal how knowledge, techniques, and political strategies spread across vast distances and cultural boundaries. Consider the remarkable connections between Harem Sultan in Istanbul and Gahar Shad in Herat, two women separated by geography and time, but linked through the transmission of political techniques. Gahar Shad, who had ruled effectively as regent in the Timurid Empire during the 15th century, had developed sophisticated methods for managing court factions and maintaining influence over multiple generations of rulers. When Harem arrived at the Ottoman court, she was educated by advisors who had studied Timurid administrative practices, including detailed accounts of Gahar Shad's political methods. The techniques Harem used to eliminate Prince Mustafa were refined versions of strategies that Gahar Shad had employed 2 centuries earlier to ensure her own lineage's succession. The transmission of knowledge worked through multiple channels. Former concubines who had gained freedom often maintained correspondence networks that spanned the Islamic world. A freed concubine from Baghdad might end up married to a merchant in Cairo, where she would share insights about Abbasid court politics with local palace women. These informal intelligence networks provided concubines with information about political developments, successful strategies, and cautionary tales from across the Islamic world. Marriage diplomacy created particularly complex interconnections. When rulers arranged marriages between their daughters or freed concubines and foreign princes, they were essentially exporting political expertise along with the bride. The Safavid practice of marrying former concubines to Uzbek tribal leaders created ongoing intelligence relationships that influenced Central Asian politics for generations. These women carried detailed knowledge of Persian administrative techniques, court intrigue methods, and military strategies to their new homes, where they often became the power behind their husbands' thrones. Trade relationships also facilitated these connections. The slave markets that supplied concubines to various Islamic courts were essentially international networks that moved not just people but also cultural knowledge and political intelligence. A Circassian woman might be captured in the Caucasus, trained in Constantinople, sold to a merchant in Alexandria, and eventually end up in the court of the Marinid dynasty in Morocco. At each stage, she would acquire new languages, cultural knowledge, and political insights that made her increasingly valuable. Perhaps most fascinating were the mentorship relationships that developed between concubines across different courts. The Ottoman archives contain extensive correspondence between harem sultan and various influential women throughout the Islamic world, including detailed discussions of political strategy, court management techniques, and child-rearing approaches. These relationships suggest that successful concubines understood themselves as part of a professional community with shared interests and challenges. Religious pilgrimage created another avenue for connection. When freed concubines undertook the Hajj to Mecca, they often traveled in groups that included women from across the Islamic world. These journeys became opportunities for intensive information exchange, with women sharing experiences, strategies, and insights gained from their various court experiences. Some of the most important political intelligence of the medieval period was probably exchanged during these supposedly religious journeys. The children of these relationships created lasting, dynastic connections that influenced international relations for centuries. Prince Bayezid, one of Hurrem's sons who challenged his brother for the Ottoman throne, fled to Safavid Persia when his rebellion failed. His presence there created ongoing tensions between the Ottoman and Persian empires, but it also established family relationships that later concubines could exploit for diplomatic purposes. Even failed relationships created important connections. When political marriages between Islamic dynasties ended in divorce or annulment, the returned wives often brought detailed intelligence about their former courts that proved invaluable for future political and military planning. The Mamluk sultans maintained a formal intelligence service staffed partly by women who had been married to rulers in neighboring kingdoms and had subsequently returned to Cairo to understand the full significance of these concubine networks. You have to understand the broader cultural context that made such relationships possible and necessary. Medieval Islamic society was simultaneously more cosmopolitan and more fragmented than most other contemporary civilizations, creating unique opportunities and challenges for women who could navigate its complexities. The linguistic diversity of the Islamic world meant that multilingual women held enormous practical value. A concubine who could speak Arabic, Persian, Turkish, and Berber could serve as an interpreter for diplomatic negotiations that would otherwise require multiple intermediaries. Understanding how to negotiate with nomadic tribal leaders required different approaches than dealing with settled, urban merchants or religious scholars. Daily life in the major Islamic courts was incredibly sophisticated by medieval standards. The Abbasid court in Baghdad maintained libraries that rivaled anything in the contemporary world and educational institutions that trained administrators for a multi-continental empire. Concubines who lived in these environments had access to educational and cultural opportunities that exceeded what was available to most free women anywhere else in the world. Yet this sophistication coexisted with constant uncertainty and violence. Political fortunes could change overnight. Dynasties could collapse within a generation, and individual rulers could prove to be brilliant or catastrophically incompetent. Concubines had to navigate this volatility while building long-term influence, requiring psychological resilience and strategic thinking that few other social positions demanded. Perhaps most fascinating was the central irony that pervaded the entire concubine system. The very legal protections and educational opportunities that made remarkable success possible also created the potential for spectacular corruption and abuse. The system's greatest strengths were inseparable from its most dangerous weaknesses. Islamic law's emphasis on treating concubines humanely created unprecedented opportunities for capable women to achieve power and influence. But these same legal protections could be manipulated by ambitious individuals to justify eliminating rivals and corrupting succession systems. Harem Sultan's marriage to Suleiman was legally correct, according to Islamic jurisprudence, but it enabled her to orchestrate Prince Mustafa's execution in ways that violated fundamental Islamic principles of justice and family obligation. Educational programs that produced remarkable administrators and cultural leaders also created women who understood how to manipulate court politics, forge documents, and orchestrate elaborate deceptions. The very skills that made concubines valuable, intelligence, cultural knowledge, political sophistication, also made them potentially dangerous to the stability of the systems they served. Modern parallels to these contradictions are striking. Contemporary debates about women's education and political participation often echo medieval Islamic discussions about the proper limits of concubine influence. The tension between individual advancement and systemic integrity that characterized the concubine system appears in different forms throughout history whenever societies create new opportunities for previously excluded groups. Perhaps most ironically, the concubine system succeeded best when it remained relatively informal and failed most dramatically when it became too systematic and ambitious. The informal influence wielded by educated concubines in the early Abbasid period contributed to effective governance and cultural flourishing. But the highly systematized Ottoman harem of later centuries, despite its sophisticated educational programs and clear hierarchies, produced the kind of factional conflicts and succession crises that ultimately weakened the empire. The greatest contradiction of all may be that the concubine system simultaneously empowered and constrained the women who participated in it. Even the most successful concubines remained legally dependent on male masters, no matter how much practical power they wielded. Their achievements were always vulnerable to changing political circumstances and the arbitrary decisions of rulers. They could influence but never fully control. Everything changed when the Ottoman Empire began its long decline in the late 17th century, marking not just the end of a particular dynasty, but the beginning of a fundamental transformation in how Islamic societies approached the institution of concubinage. The failure of the Second Siege of Vienna in 1683 wasn't just a military defeat. It was the moment when the Islamic world began to confront the reality that its traditional systems, including the concubine institution that had produced so many capable rulers and administrators, were no longer adequate for competing with rapidly modernizing European powers. The shift began subtly, with changes in attitude rather than formal policy. The Sultanate of Women period in Ottoman history, roughly from 1520 to 1656, had demonstrated both the potential and the dangers of extensive female political influence. While women like Hurrem Sultan and Qasim Sultan had wielded unprecedented power, their factional conflicts had also contributed to political instability and military weakness. By the late 1600s, Ottoman reformers increasingly viewed the harem system as a symbol of the empire's problems rather than a source of strength. This timing wasn't coincidental. The same period witnessed the scientific revolution in Europe, the rise of standing armies with professional officer corps, and the development of more systematic approaches to state administration. European visitors to Ottoman courts began writing accounts that portrayed the harem system as exotic but backward, contributing to a growing sense among educated Muslims that their societies needed to adopt European models to survive. The intellectual foundations for change came from within Islamic civilization itself. Reformist scholars like the Ottoman Chatib Kalebi and later figures like the Egyptian al-Jabardi began questioning whether traditional institutions were compatible with the demands of the modern world. They didn't reject Islamic principles, but they argued that many practices associated with Islamic civilization, including concubinage, were cultural adaptations, rather than religious requirements, and could be modified or abandoned without compromising Islamic identity. What made this moment different from earlier periods of reform was the external pressure from European expansion. The Islamic world had experienced internal crises and foreign invasions before, but never had the technological and organizational gap between Islamic and non-Islamic societies been so dramatic. European military superiority wasn't just about weapons. It reflected more efficient administrative systems, better educated populations, and more meritocratic institutions that Islamic reformers increasingly saw as incompatible with traditional court systems built around personal relationships and hereditary privilege. The change wasn't immediate or uniform. Different Islamic societies responded at different speeds and in different ways to these pressures. The Ottoman Empire attempted gradual reform while maintaining traditional structures. The Safavid Empire in Persia collapsed entirely, replaced by more military-focused dynasties. The Mughal Empire in India fragmented, with different successor states pursuing different strategies for dealing with European pressure. But across the Islamic world, the consensus was growing that fundamental changes were necessary for survival. The transformation of the concubine system unfolded through several overlapping processes that reflected broader changes in Islamic society's relationship with modernity and European influence. The changes weren't imposed from outside. They emerged from internal debates among Islamic intellectuals, administrators, and rulers who increasingly saw traditional institutions as obstacles to necessary reforms. The Ottoman Tanzimat reforms, beginning in 1839, represented the most systematic attempt to modernize an Islamic state while maintaining Islamic identity. The reformers didn't initially target the harem system directly, but their emphasis on legal equality, administrative meritocracy, and European-style education created obvious contradictions within an institution based on slavery and personal relationships. The 1856 imperial rescript that officially abolished slavery within the Ottoman Empire made the legal foundation of concubinage untenable, even though the practice continued informally for decades. Educational reform proved particularly important in changing attitudes toward concubinage. The establishment of European-style schools and military academies created a new class of educated Ottoman administrators who had been trained in ideas about individual rights, legal equality, and rational administration that were difficult to reconcile with traditional court practices. These men didn't necessarily oppose Islamic values, but they increasingly viewed the harem system as an embarrassing anachronism that reinforced European stereotypes about Islamic backwardness. Women's voices became increasingly important in this process, though often in ways that weren't immediately obvious. The memoirs of Layla Saz, an Ottoman princess writing in the late 19th century, reveal how women within the imperial harem had become aware of European ideas about women's rights and education. Many palace women began advocating for changes that would give them more autonomy and public roles rather than limiting them to behind-the-scenes influence. Ironically, some of the most effective criticism of the concubine system came from women who had lived within it. The process accelerated dramatically after the Young Turk Revolution of 1908, which brought to power a generation of Ottoman reformers explicitly committed to European-style modernization. The new constitution included provisions for legal equality that made the continuation of slavery-based institutions impossible to defend. More importantly, the Young Turk emphasis on Turkish nationalism created ideological frameworks that viewed the multi-ethnic, cosmopolitan culture of the traditional Ottoman court as incompatible with modern national identity. Regional variations reveal how local factors shaped the transformation. In Egypt, Muhammad Ali Pasha's reforms had begun dismantling traditional court structures as early as the 1810s, replacing them with European-style administrative systems. The Cairo dynasty in Persia maintained traditional structures longer but found them increasingly ineffective against European pressure. The constitutional revolution of 1906 represented a decisive break with practices reformers viewed as incompatible with modern governance. The Wahhabi movement in Arabia had rejected the concubine system much earlier on purely religious grounds. arguing that elaborate court cultures were corruptions of original Islamic simplicity. The Saudi conquest of the Hijaz in the 1920s represented the triumph of this purist interpretation over the cosmopolitan Islamic culture that had supported concubinage for centuries. That resistance came from several quarters. Conservative religious authorities defended traditional practices, though increasingly focusing on cultural preservation rather than theological necessity. Palace officials whose careers depended on traditional structures opposed reforms. Some women within harem systems resisted changes that might reduce their influence, preferring traditional forms of power to uncertain alternatives. The economic dimensions proved particularly important. European colonial expansion disrupted the trade networks that had made elaborate court cultures economically viable. The slave trade that supplied concubines became increasingly difficult to maintain as European powers imposed abolition treaties. Without access to human resources, the institution became unsustainable regardless of political preferences. World War I and its aftermath accelerated these processes dramatically. The collapse of the Ottoman Empire eliminated the most important center of traditional Islamic court culture. The establishment of European mandates throughout the Middle East introduced administrative systems that had no place for traditional institutions. The new nation-states that emerged from the war were explicitly committed to European-style modernization programs that viewed traditional court practices as obstacles to progress. The new Islamic world that emerged from these transformations was fundamentally different from the medieval civilization that had created and sustained the concubine system. The changes weren't just institutional. They reflected a complete reimagining of Islamic societies, relationship with political power, social hierarchy, and gender roles that made the traditional concubine system not just impractical, but intellectually incoherent. Legal systems throughout the Islamic world had been transformed by European influence and internal reform movements. The new legal codes, whether based on French civil law in Ottoman successor states or British common law in former colonial territories, included provisions for legal equality and individual rights that made slavery-based institutions impossible to maintain. Even in regions that maintained Islamic law as the basis for personal status issues, the broader legal framework had shifted in ways that eliminated the complex intermediate statuses that had made concubinage possible. Educational systems had been revolutionized in ways that created new expectations about women's roles and capabilities. The establishment of schools for girls, teacher training colleges, and even universities accessible to women created alternatives to the informal education systems that had developed within harem contexts. Women could now gain literacy, professional skills, and cultural knowledge through public institutions, rather than depending on the chance of being selected for court service. The economic foundations had disappeared entirely. The elaborate court cultures that supported thousands of concubines and cultural specialists were no longer economically viable in a world dominated by European industrial production. The new Middle Eastern states needed engineers, doctors, and accountants more than poets, musicians and court administrators trained in traditional arts. The political culture had changed in ways that made personal relationships and informal influence networks seem anachronistic. The new ideologies of nationalism, socialism, and liberal democracy emphasized impersonal institutions, rule of law, and public accountability incompatible with governance through personal relationships and behind-the-scenes influence. The cultural transformation was equally dramatic. The modernist movements that dominated intellectual life throughout the Islamic world in the early 20th century explicitly rejected the courtly culture that had sustained concubinage, viewing it as a symbol of the decadence and weakness that had allowed European domination. Writers, artists, and intellectuals celebrated new ideals of romantic love, companionate marriage, and women's public participation that made the concubine system seem not just outdated but morally objectionable. Yet the transition wasn't complete or uniform. In some regions, particularly rural areas and among traditional elites, practices resembling the old system continued informally well into the 20th century. Wealthy men maintained multiple wives or unofficial relationships that provided some of the same functions as traditional concubinage, though without the legal framework or cultural acceptance that had characterized the medieval system. The new reality also created new problems. The elimination of the concubine system removed one avenue for social mobility available to women from poor backgrounds. The new emphasis on formal education created opportunities for middle-class women but often excluded those without access to modern schooling. In some ways, modernized Islamic societies of the 20th century were less flexible than the traditional systems they had replaced. Was this change positive or negative for women and Islamic society? The answer depends on perspective and evaluation criteria, but the transformation involved both significant gains and substantial losses that continue to influence contemporary debates about tradition, modernity, and women's roles in Islamic societies. From the perspective of individual rights and legal equality, eliminating the concubine system represented clear progress. The new legal frameworks provided women with formal protections, educational opportunities, and theoretical equality that had never existed within traditional systems. Women could now own property, pursue careers, and participate in public life without depending on powerful men's patronage. However, the transition also eliminated genuine opportunities the traditional system had provided. The concubine system had created pathways for remarkable women to achieve real power and influence. Figures like Harem Sultan or Shajar al-Durr had wielded authority that few women in the modern Middle East have matched. The informal networks that characterized traditional Islamic politics had sometimes been more flexible than the bureaucratic institutions that replaced them. The cultural evaluation is equally complex. Eliminating concubinage was part of rejecting the cosmopolitan, multi-ethnic culture that had characterized the great Islamic empires. The new emphasis on national identity created more homogeneous societies, but eliminated much cultural creativity and intellectual sophistication that had flourished within traditional court environments. Modern scholars continue to debate whether the changes represented genuine progress or simply replacing one form of inequality with another. Some feminist historians argue that the concubine system had provided women with more real agency than the supposedly modern societies that replaced it. Others contend that any system based on slavery was fundamentally incompatible with human dignity. What seems clear is that the transformation marked the end of a distinctive phase in Islamic civilization. The sophisticated synthesis of Islamic law, Persian administrative traditions, and cosmopolitan court culture that had sustained the concubine system for centuries had been permanently disrupted by the encounter with European modernity. The contrast with the classical period of Islamic civilization is particularly striking. The medieval Islamic world had developed sophisticated approaches to women's participation in political and cultural life through the concubine system. In the years and decades following the formal abolition of the concubine system, the Islamic world grappled with the practical challenges of implementing new social arrangements while managing the cultural and psychological aftermath of abandoning an institution that had shaped Islamic civilization for over a millennium. The transition proved far more complex and incomplete than reformers had anticipated, creating new forms of inequality and social tension that persist to this day. The immediate aftermath revealed how deeply embedded the concubine system had been in Islamic social structures. When the Ottoman Empire abolished slavery in 1856, thousands of women who had lived as concubines found themselves in legal limbo. They were technically free, but many lacked the resources or social connections necessary to establish independent lives. Limited government support programs were inadequate for addressing the scale of social disruption. Many former concubines faced impossible choices. Those who had borne children often chose to remain in their former households as servants, rather than risk losing contact with their children. Others attempted to return to their regions of origin, only to discover that their families had died, moved, or no longer recognized them. A significant number ended up in urban poverty, working as domestic servants or seamstresses for subsistence wages. The children of concubine relationships faced particular difficulties. While Islamic law had recognized them as legitimate heirs, social stigma often limited their opportunities in the new social order. Many found themselves caught between worlds, too elevated by their paternal lineage to fit into working-class society, but too tainted by their mother's origins to be accepted by traditional elites. Regional variations in how societies managed. This transition created lasting differences in how former concubines and their descendants were integrated into modern Islamic societies. In Turkey, the new republic's emphasis on secular modernization and women's rights provided some opportunities for former palace women to establish new identities as teachers, nurses, or businesswomen. In contrast, more conservative regions often maintained informal versions of traditional hierarchies that continued to disadvantage women with concubine backgrounds. The economic disruption was equally significant. The elaborate networks of patronage, trade relationships, and cultural exchange that had developed around major courts collapsed along with the institutions that had sustained them. Cities like Istanbul, Cairo, and Isfahan lost much of their cultural dynamism as the wealthy households that had supported artists, scholars, and craftsmen disappeared or dramatically reduced their activities. Perhaps most importantly, the abolition of concubinage created an ideological vacuum that different groups attempted to fill with competing visions of women's proper roles in Islamic society. Conservative religious authorities argued for stricter interpretations of traditional family structures that would prevent the kind of female political influence that had characterized the concubine system. Modernist reformers advocated for European-style gender relations that emphasized companionate marriage and women's public participation. Nationalist movements developed their own interpretations that often subordinated women's rights to broader political goals. The collapse of the traditional concubine system created space for new types of female political and cultural influence to emerge, though often in forms that were less visible and more constrained than what had been possible under the old arrangements. These new players operated in different institutional contexts and faced different opportunities and limitations than their predecessors. The rise of modern educational systems produced a new class of educated women who could claim authority based on professional credentials rather than personal relationships with powerful men. Figures like Halide Edip Adivar in Turkey and Huda Sha'rawi in Egypt represented this new type of female leader. Women who had received European-style educations and could participate in public debates about nationalism and social reform. However, their influence was often more limited than it appeared. While they could speak publicly and write about social issues, they rarely achieved the kind of direct political power that figures like Harem Sultan had exercised. The new institutional structures were generally designed to exclude women from real decision-making authority, even as they provided platforms for expressing opinions. The development of modern mass media created new opportunities for women to shape public opinion. Women's magazines and novels provided platforms for discussing female experiences and challenging traditional restrictions. Writers like Fatima Mernissi in Morocco used these media to critique both traditional Islamic arrangements and Western colonial influences, developing distinctly feminist perspectives. Religious institutions also produced new types of female authority figures who filled some of the cultural roles that had previously been occupied by educated concubines. Female religious teachers, Sufi masters, and scholars gained recognition for their expertise in Islamic law and theology. Unlike concubines who had influenced religious policy through their relationships with rulers, these women claimed authority based on their own scholarly achievements and spiritual insights. The emergence of nationalist movements throughout the Islamic world created another avenue for female political participation. Women like Sayyidah Nabarawi in Egypt and Fatima Jinnah in Pakistan gained prominence through their involvement in independence struggles and nation-building projects. However, their political influence was often temporary and symbolic, declining once independence was achieved and more conventional political arrangements were established. Perhaps most significantly, the growth of professional occupations provided new paths for social mobility that had previously been available primarily through concubinage. Women could now become teachers, nurses, doctors, and lawyers through merit and education rather than depending on the patronage of powerful men. While these professions initially offered limited influence, compared to the political authority that successful concubines had wielded, they provided more secure and independent forms of social advancement. The oil wealth that transformed many Islamic societies in the mid-20th century created yet another category of influential women. The wives and daughters of wealthy oil sheiks, industrial magnates, and government officials often wielded considerable economic power through their control of family resources and business networks. While these women operated within formal family structures rather than the quasi-independent status that concubines had enjoyed, their economic influence often translated into significant political and cultural authority. International connections became increasingly important for women seeking influence in the modern Islamic world. Those who could navigate relationships with European and American institutions, whether through education, marriage, or professional connections, often gained access to resources and platforms that were unavailable through purely domestic channels. This created new forms of cultural authority, but also new dependencies on foreign approval and support. Despite the formal abolition of the concubine system and decades of modernization efforts, many of the fundamental issues that had characterized traditional Islamic approaches to women, power, and social mobility persisted in new forms throughout the 20th and into the 21st centuries. These continuities reveal how deeply embedded certain patterns had become in Islamic social structures and how difficult they proved to transform through legal and institutional changes alone. The tension between public rhetoric about women's equality and private practices that limited women's autonomy remained constant in many Islamic societies. While constitutions formally granted women equal rights, informal arrangements often recreated traditional hierarchies in new contexts. Wealthy men continued to maintain multiple relationships with women who depended on their patronage, though these were now labeled as temporary marriage or kept secret rather than formally recognized. Economic dependence continued to shape women's options in ways that resembled traditional patterns. In societies where women had limited access to independent employment, marriage to wealthy men remained one of the few paths to economic security. The informal nature of these arrangements often left women more vulnerable than under traditional systems that had provided legal protections. Educational achievements often failed to translate into proportional political influence. Many Islamic societies invested heavily in women's education, producing highly qualified female professionals, but continued to restrict women's participation in political leadership and business ownership. This created frustration as educated women found their aspirations constrained by persistent cultural barriers. The politicization of women's issues in the context of conflicts between Islamic traditionalism and Western modernization complicated efforts to address these ongoing problems. Debates about women's roles became entangled with broader questions about cultural authenticity, foreign influence, and Islamic identity, making it difficult to develop solutions that addressed women's practical needs while maintaining social cohesion and cultural continuity. Regional conflicts and political instability disrupted many of the gains that women had achieved during periods of modernization and reform. Wars, revolutions, and economic crises often led to the reimposition of traditional restrictions as society sought stability through familiar social arrangements. The experiences of women in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria during recent decades illustrate how quickly progress toward gender equality can be reversed when political systems collapse. The rise of various Islamist movements created new challenges for women seeking influence and autonomy within Islamic frameworks. These movements often advocated for the restoration of authentic Islamic practices that were based on idealized interpretations of early Islamic history rather than the complex realities of how Islamic societies had actually functioned during their periods of greatest achievement. This led to the rejection of many of the sophisticated approaches to women's roles that had characterized classical Islamic civilization. Globalization and international migration created new opportunities for some women, while exacerbating problems for others. Women who could access international education, employment, or marriage opportunities often gained unprecedented freedom and influence. However, those who remained within traditional communities sometimes found their options even more restricted as these communities sought to preserve their identity against perceived external threats. The persistence of these issues suggests that the transformation of the concubine system was more superficial than many reformers had hoped. While the formal institutions changed dramatically, many of the underlying social dynamics that had shaped women's experiences in Islamic societies proved remarkably resilient and adaptable to new circumstances. Compared to earlier periods of Islamic history and to developments in other parts of the world, the transformation of women's roles in 20th century Islamic societies reveals both the distinctive features of Islamic approaches to gender and social change and the universal challenges that societies face when attempting to modernize traditional institutions while maintaining cultural continuity. The contrast with the classical period of Islamic civilization is particularly striking. The medieval Islamic world had developed sophisticated approaches to women's participation in political and cultural life through the concubine system. While these arrangements were based on legal inequality, they had created real opportunities for capable women to achieve influence that surpassed what was available in most contemporary societies. The modern period's emphasis on formal legal equality represented genuine progress in human rights, but it also eliminated many practical pathways to power that had existed within traditional systems. The bureaucratic institutions that replaced traditional court politics were often less accessible to women than the personal relationships that had characterized earlier periods. When compared to other regions undergoing modernization, Islamic societies faced unique challenges related to their historical relationship with the concubine system. European societies could more easily adopt new approaches without confronting the loss of previous forms of female authority. The colonial experience further complicated matters, creating dynamics where women's rights became symbols of both progressive modernization and dangerous foreign influence. The persistence of informal practices, resembling traditional concubinage, despite formal abolition, suggests that legal changes alone are insufficient to transform deep-seated social patterns. Successful transformation requires not just new laws, but also new cultural narratives that can provide alternative sources of meaning and opportunity. Yet even as these modern adaptations emerged throughout the 20th century, The fundamental question remained: had Islamic societies found adequate replacements for the sophisticated systems of female advancement that the concubine institution had provided? The answer would become clearer as these societies faced new challenges that would test whether their modern arrangements could produce the kind of capable female leadership that had once emerged from palace halls and court schools. The ultimate test would come when these systems faced their greatest crisis, the point where traditional structures would either prove their resilience or collapse entirely under the weight of historical change taught by the early 20th century. Signs pointed unmistakably toward the final collapse of the concubine system and the traditional Islamic court culture that had sustained it for over a millennium. The writing was on the wall, visible to anyone who cared to look, but many of those with the most to lose from these changes either couldn't see what was coming or chose to ignore the mounting evidence that their world was about to disappear forever. The last Ottoman sultans represented this tragic blindness perfectly. Sultan Abdulhamid II, who ruled from 1876 to 1909, maintained one of the largest harems in Ottoman history, even as his empire crumbled around him. He continued to purchase new concubines and expand the palace quarters for women while losing territory to European powers, facing internal rebellions, and watching his government's finances collapse. European visitors reported the surreal spectacle of elaborate harem ceremonies taking place in a palace where the heating often didn't work because the government couldn't afford fuel. The contradictions became increasingly impossible to ignore. Young Ottoman intellectuals who had been educated in European universities returned home to find their fathers still conducting politics through personal relationships with palace women, while European armies occupied Ottoman territories using superior technology. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. How could institutions that had once represented sophistication and power have become symbols of backwardness? Similar patterns appeared throughout the Islamic world. In Persia, the Qajar maintained traditional harems while granting economic concessions to European powers. In India, the last Mughal emperor presided over elaborate court ceremonies, while the British East India Company ruled his former territories through efficient, bureaucratic systems. The economic foundations had become completely unsustainable. The global trade networks that had once made Islamic courts wealthy centers of commerce had been disrupted by European colonial expansion. The slave trade that supplied concubines was being systematically eliminated. The artisan traditions that supported court culture were being destroyed by cheaper, European manufactured goods. Perhaps most tellingly, the children of traditional Islamic elites were increasingly choosing European-style educations over traditional court service. Sons who might once have become palace administrators were studying engineering in Paris and London. Daughters who might have sought positions as educated concubines were instead demanding access to schools and universities. The human capital that had sustained traditional institutions was literally walking away. Religious authorities who had once provided theological justification for traditional practices were also beginning to change their positions. The growing influence of reformist Islamic movements meant that practices like concubinage were increasingly viewed as cultural corruptions rather than religiously sanctioned institutions. Even conservative scholars found it difficult to defend systems that were so obviously associated with political weakness and social backwardness. The psychological impact of these changes was profound. The Islamic world had experienced military defeats and political crises before, but never had there been such a comprehensive challenge to the cultural foundations of Islamic civilization. The concubine system hadn't just been a political institution. It had been part of a broader worldview that emphasized personal relationships, cultural sophistication, and the importance of individual excellence within hierarchical structures. The collapse of this system represented the end of an entire way of understanding how societies should be organized and how power should be exercised. The final death blow to the traditional concubine system came not from internal reform movements or European pressure, but from the catastrophic upheavals of World War I and its aftermath, which destroyed the last remaining centers of traditional Islamic court culture and made any revival of these institutions politically impossible and culturally inconceivable. The Ottoman Empire's entry into World War I on the side of Germany sealed the fate of the world's last great Islamic court. As the war progressed and Ottoman military positions became increasingly desperate, the elaborate court ceremonies and harem rituals that had characterized imperial life for centuries began to seem not just irrelevant, but actively harmful too. The war effort. Young Turkish officers returning from the disastrous Gallipoli campaign found the spectacle of palace women receiving European visitors while Turkish soldiers died in trenches to be an unbearable symbol of imperial decadence. The final scenes were almost surreal in their disconnection from reality. In 1918, as Allied forces occupied Constantinople and the Ottoman government collapsed, Sultan Mehmed VI continued to maintain the traditional harem system, apparently believing that preserving court protocols would somehow maintain imperial legitimacy. European observers reported the bizarre spectacle of palace women conducting elaborate ceremonies to receive diplomatic wives while British and French administrators took control of Ottoman ministries and military installations. The revolution that brought Mustafa Kemal Ataturk to power represented the complete rejection of everything the traditional court system had represented. The new Turkish Republic didn't just abolish the Sultanate, it systematically eliminated every institution and symbol associated with the old regime. The Topkapi Palace was converted into a museum, its harem quarters becoming tourist attractions rather than centers of political power. The last Ottoman concubines were pensioned off or found employment as teachers and translators, their unique skills suddenly valuable only as historical curiosities. Similar scenes played out across the former Islamic world. In Persia, Reza Shah Pahlavi's modernization campaign systematically dismantled traditional court structures, forcing the remaining members of royal harems to choose between European-style marriages or spinsterhood. In India, the abolition of the princely states after independence eliminated the last centers where traditional concubine relationships had continued to exist, often in highly attenuated forms. The psychological transformation was as dramatic as the institutional changes. The generation of Islamic leaders who came to power after World War I had been shaped by the trauma of military defeat and foreign occupation. They viewed traditional institutions not as sources of cultural pride, but as embarrassing reminders of weakness and backwardness. The new Turkish, Arab, and Persian nationalisms all defined themselves explicitly in opposition to the cosmopolitan court culture that had characterized classical Islamic civilization. Perhaps most symbolically, the last practicing concubines often found themselves completely unable to adapt to the new world being created around them. Women who had been trained in classical Arabic poetry, Persian literature, and Ottoman court protocols discovered that these skills were not just irrelevant but actually harmful in societies that were desperately trying to prove their modern credentials to skeptical European observers. The archives contain heartbreaking accounts of former palace women trying to find their place in the new order. Some attempted to become teachers, only to discover that their classical educations were considered inferior to European-style training. Others tried to establish businesses, but found that their lack of experience with modern economic relationships left them vulnerable to exploitation. Many simply retreated into private life, becoming living relics of a disappeared world. The children of these relationships faced particularly difficult transitions. Young people who had grown up expecting to inherit positions in traditional court hierarchies suddenly found themselves in societies where such positions no longer existed. Some successfully reinvented themselves as modern professionals, but others struggled with identity crises that reflected the broader cultural trauma of Islamic societies during this period, by 1925. The transformation was essentially complete. The last Ottoman caliph had been exiled from Turkey. The last Qajar Shah had been deposed in Persia, and the last Mughal pretender had died in obscurity in India. The institutional frameworks that had sustained the concubine system for over 1,000 years had been eliminated not through gradual reform, but through sudden, revolutionary change that left no possibility for revival or adaptation. The collapse of the concubine system resulted from the convergence of multiple historical forces that made its continuation not just impractical but intellectually impossible. Within the new frameworks that came to dominate Islamic societies during the early 20th century, understanding why this happened requires examining both the immediate causes and the deeper structural changes that made traditional Islamic institutions incompatible with modern political and social arrangements. The most obvious factor was military defeat and foreign occupation, which discredited traditional Islamic institutions by associating them with weakness and failure. The Ottoman Empire's catastrophic performance in World War I and European colonization created an overwhelming sense that traditional approaches to governance had proven inadequate for survival in the modern world. The military defeat alone cannot explain the completeness of the transformation. What made the 20th century different was the emergence of new ideologies, nationalism, socialism, and liberal democracy that offered comprehensive alternatives to traditional Islamic approaches, complete with institutions and cultural practices that had no place for concubinage. These new ideologies addressed real problems that traditional Islamic institutions had proven unable to solve. The concubine system had worked well within pre-modern Islamic civilization, but it was poorly adapted to industrialized societies requiring mass education, professional bureaucracies, and democratic participation. The economic foundations had also been permanently disrupted by global industrialization and colonial relationships. The elaborate patronage networks that had sustained palace women and court administrators were no longer economically viable in a world dominated by European industrial production. Perhaps most importantly, the intellectual foundations had been undermined by new ideas about individual rights and gender equality that made traditional hierarchical relationships seem morally objectionable. The Islamic world's encounter with European liberalism had created new expectations about human dignity incompatible with slavery-based arrangements. The immediate aftermath of the concubine system's collapse created a complex legacy that influenced Islamic societies throughout the 20th century, leaving behind both practical problems that required immediate solutions and cultural wounds that would take generations to heal. The sudden disappearance of institutions that had shaped Islamic civilization for over a millennium created vacuums that different groups attempted to fill with varying degrees of success. The most pressing immediate challenge was what to do with thousands of women who had lived within the system but now found themselves without institutional support. The new governments generally provided minimal assistance, viewing these women as embarrassing reminders of rejected pasts. Many former concubines ended up in poverty, working as domestic servants for subsistence wages. The children of concubine relationships faced particular difficulties establishing their identities within the new social orders. While Islamic law had recognized them as legitimate heirs, the stigma associated with their mothers' status often limited their opportunities in societies desperately trying to establish modern credentials. Educational institutions faced the challenge of replacing sophisticated but informal training programs that had developed within palace contexts. Traditional Islamic courts had produced some of the most culturally sophisticated women in world history, but their knowledge was difficult to transfer to formal educational systems. Much cultural expertise was simply lost. Perhaps most importantly, the collapse created ideological confusion about women's proper roles in Islamic societies that persist today. The concubine system had been problematic, but it had also provided clear pathways for capable women to achieve influence. The new arrangements often promised greater formal equality, but delivered less practical opportunity for female leadership. The concubine system had been problematic in many ways, but it had also provided clear pathways for capable women to achieve influence and authority. The new arrangements often promised greater formal equality, but delivered less practical opportunity for female leadership. Different Islamic societies developed different approaches to managing this legacy. Turkey's secular republic attempted to create entirely new roles for women based on European models. Arab nationalist movements often subordinated women's issues to broader political goals. Conservative religious movements sometimes advocated for restrictions that were actually more limiting than what had existed under traditional systems. The international implications were equally complex. European powers and their local allies used the abolition of concubinage as evidence of Islamic society's progress toward civilization, but this narrative often ignored the sophisticated aspects of traditional institutions while exaggerating the benefits of European-inspired alternatives. This created lasting resentments that influenced later anti-colonial movements and contemporary debates about Western influence in Islamic societies. The legacy of the concubine system shaped Islamic civilization in ways that continue to influence modern Middle Eastern and Islamic societies, often in subtle forms that affect everything from political culture to social expectations about women's roles. The 1,000-year history of this institution left deep imprints on Islamic legal thinking, social structures, and cultural assumptions that persist even in societies that have formally rejected traditional arrangements. Most significantly, the concubine system established precedents for women's political participation that created lasting expectations about female capability and authority within Islamic contexts. While based on legal inequality, it had demonstrated that women could successfully manage complex administrative responsibilities, conduct diplomatic negotiations, and exercise real political power. This legacy influenced later debates about women's rights in Islamic societies. The sophisticated educational approaches developed within harem contexts also left lasting influences on Islamic approaches to women's education. The emphasis on multilingual competency, cultural sophistication, and practical administrative skills established models that influenced the development of modern educational institutions throughout the Islamic world. The system's integration of diverse ethnic and cultural backgrounds shaped Islamic attitudes toward pluralism and social mobility in ways that distinguished Islamic societies from other medieval civilizations. Women from the Caucasus, Central Asia, Africa, and Europe could achieve positions of influence within Islamic courts, creating cultural patterns that emphasized individual merit over ethnic origins. This legacy influenced later Islamic approaches to nationalism, citizenship, and cultural identity. Economic patterns established during the classical period also had lasting effects. The tradition of women owning and managing independent businesses, which had been common among freed concubines, influenced Islamic commercial law and social expectations about women's economic participation. Unlike many other traditional societies, the Islamic world maintained legal frameworks that allowed women to own property and accumulate wealth independently. The concubine system's influence on Islamic legal development was equally profound. The complex jurisprudence that developed around concubine rights and the status of children from these relationships contributed to sophisticated legal thinking about individual rights and family relationships that influenced broader Islamic legal development. Cultural and artistic legacies were also significant. The palace cultures that had sustained concubine systems had been major centers of artistic and intellectual development throughout Islamic history. The poetry, music, architecture, and decorative arts that emerged from these contexts established aesthetic traditions that continued to influence Islamic culture long after the institutional arrangements that had created them disappeared. Economic patterns established during the classical period also had lasting effects. The tradition of women owning and managing independent businesses, which had been common among freed concubines, influenced Islamic commercial law and social expectations about women's economic participation. Unlike many other traditional societies, the Islamic world maintained legal frameworks that allowed women to own property, engage in trade, and accumulate wealth independently of male relatives. The concubine system's influence on Islamic legal development was equally profound. The complex jurisprudence that developed around concubine rights, manumission procedures, and the status of children from these relationships contributed to sophisticated legal thinking about individual rights, family relationships, and social obligations that influenced broader Islamic legal development. Many principles that were developed in the context of concubinage were later applied to other areas of Islamic law. Cultural and artistic legacies were also significant. The palace cultures that had sustained concubine systems had been major centers of artistic and intellectual development throughout Islamic history. The poetry, music, architecture, and decorative arts that emerged from these contexts established aesthetic traditions that continued to influence Islamic culture long after the institutional arrangements that had created them disappeared. Perhaps most importantly, the concubine system's history provided Islamic societies with a complex legacy regarding the relationship between tradition and modernity. Unlike European societies, which could portray the abandonment of traditional practices as unambiguous progress, Islamic societies had to grapple with the fact that some traditional institutions had provided genuine opportunities and protections that modern arrangements often failed to match. This created ongoing tensions between different visions of Islamic authenticity. Some contemporary Islamic movements view the classical period that included concubinage as representing the height of Islamic civilization and seek to revive elements of traditional court culture. Others argue that these institutions represented corruptions of original Islamic principles and advocate for approaches based on early Islamic precedents rather than later historical developments. The memory of the concubine system also influenced Islamic responses to European colonialism and later Western influence. The fact that European powers had used the existence of concubinage to justify colonial intervention created lasting suspicions about Western criticism of Islamic institutions, even when that criticism addressed genuine problems. Today, we can see echoes of the concubine system in various aspects of contemporary Middle Eastern and Islamic societies, though these parallels often take less obvious forms than direct institutional continuations. The patterns of relationship between wealth, power, and women's opportunities that characterize traditional concubinage appear in modern contexts, adapted to contemporary frameworks, but reflecting similar underlying dynamics. The role of wealthy Gulf families in providing educational opportunities for women from less privileged backgrounds bears remarkable similarities to traditional advancement patterns. Modern scholarship programs and cultural foundations often function as pathways for capable young women to gain access to elite social circles that would otherwise be unavailable. Strategic marriages between wealthy Middle Eastern men and educated women from different cultural backgrounds also reflect traditional patterns. These relationships often involve women who gain significant social status, while bringing cultural sophistication and international connections that enhance their husbands' business activities. Modern diplomatic and business cultures continue to reflect the emphasis on personal relationships and informal networks that characterize traditional court politics. The role of wives and female family members in facilitating business relationships and political negotiations often follows patterns established during the classical period. The rise of social media and international communications has created new opportunities for women in Islamic societies to gain influence and authority that parallel some aspects of traditional concubine advancement. Women who can effectively navigate international cultural and political networks often gain access to resources and platforms that allow them to achieve influence within their own societies, much as concubines had used their cultural sophistication and personal connections to gain political authority. The phenomenon of wasta, the use of personal connections and informal influence networks to achieve practical goals, remains central to political and economic life throughout the Middle East and reflects cultural patterns that were established during the period when concubine networks had provided crucial channels for information, resources, and political influence. Sound familiar? The tension between individual empowerment and cultural authenticity that characterizes many contemporary debates about women's roles in Islamic societies reflects deeper patterns that have persisted across centuries of political and social change. While the specific institutional arrangements have changed dramatically, many of the underlying dynamics that shape the concubine system continue to influence how Islamic societies approach questions of gender, power, and social organization. The rise of social media and international communications has created new opportunities for women in Islamic societies to gain influence and authority that parallel some aspects of traditional concubine advancement. Women who can effectively navigate international cultural and political networks often gain access to resources and platforms that allow them to achieve influence within their own societies, much as concubines had used their cultural sophistication and personal connections to gain political authority. Modern Islamic movements that emphasize women's religious education and spiritual authority also reflect patterns that were established during the classical period. The tradition of learned women who gained influence through religious knowledge and cultural authority, which had been common among educated concubines, continues in contemporary forms through female religious teachers, scholars, and spiritual leaders. The phenomenon of wasta, the use of personal connections and informal influence networks to achieve practical goals, remains central to political and economic life throughout the Middle East and reflects cultural patterns that were established during the period when concubine networks had provided crucial channels for information, resources, and political influence. Perhaps most significantly, contemporary discussions about work-life balance, family responsibilities, and women's professional aspirations in Islamic societies often grapple with questions that were also central to the concubine system. How can societies provide women with genuine opportunities for advancement while maintaining cultural continuity and family stability? How can individual achievement be balanced with collective obligations? These questions don't have easy answers today, just as they didn't during the classical period. Sound familiar? The tension between individual empowerment and cultural authenticity that characterizes many contemporary debates about women's roles in Islamic societies reflects deeper patterns that have persisted across centuries of political and social change. While the specific institutional arrangements have changed dramatically, many of the underlying dynamics that shape the concubine system continue to influence how Islamic societies approach questions of gender, power, and social organization. Even now, the concubine system influences multiple areas of contemporary Islamic societies in ways that often remain unrecognized, but nonetheless shape ongoing cultural and political developments. Academic study of Islamic history has been profoundly influenced by attempts to understand how these traditional institutions functioned and what their abolition meant for the development of modern Islamic societies. Popular culture throughout. The Islamic world continues to grapple with the legacy of the concubine system through literature, film, and television productions that explore themes of female agency, traditional versus modern values, and the relationship between personal relationships and political power. Turkish television dramas about Ottoman court life have gained international popularity, partly because they address contemporary questions about women's roles through historical narratives that allow exploration of sensitive topics. Political discourse in many Islamic societies continues to reference the classical period's achievements in ways that implicitly include the concubine system's contributions to Islamic civilization. When contemporary leaders celebrate the Golden Age of Islamic culture, they are often referencing periods when concubine-influenced courts were major centers of learning, artistic development, and political sophistication. Social movements advocating for women's rights within Islamic frameworks frequently draw on historical precedents that include examples of influential concubines who achieve remarkable success within traditional systems. These movements argue that Islam has always recognized women's capabilities and that contemporary restrictions represent departures from historical Islamic practice rather than authentic expressions of Islamic values. The ongoing influence appears most clearly in legal and theological discussions about Islamic approaches to gender relations, family structure, and social organization. Contemporary Islamic scholars continue to grapple with questions about how traditional Islamic legal principles should be applied in modern contexts. And these discussions often involve examining the precedents established during the classical period when concubinage was an accepted part of Islamic society. International relations between Islamic societies and the broader world also continue to be influenced by the concubine system's legacy. The fact that Western powers had historically used the existence of concubinage to justify intervention in Islamic societies created lasting sensitivities about foreign criticism of Islamic institutions and practices. Contemporary debates about human rights, women's equality, and cultural authenticity often reflect these historical experiences and the defensive attitudes they created. The influence extends to architectural and urban planning in many Islamic societies, where traditional palace complexes and their harem quarters have been preserved as museums and tourist attractions that shape how both local populations and international visitors understand Islamic historical achievements and cultural values. What can contemporary societies learn from this complex historical institution that simultaneously represented sophisticated approaches to women's advancement and deeply problematic systems of inequality? The lessons offer important insights into the challenges of creating societies that provide genuine opportunities while maintaining cultural continuity. First, the concubine system's history demonstrates that legal equality and practical opportunity don't always coincide. While modern societies have achieved formal equality between men and women, the concubine system had often provided more practical pathways to real power than exist in many contemporary arrangements. This suggests that achieving genuine gender equality requires creating institutional arrangements that provide meaningful opportunities for advancement. Second, the system's educational approaches offer lessons about comprehensive, culturally grounded education that prepares individuals for leadership roles. The sophisticated training programs that developed within harem contexts had produced some of the most capable administrators in Islamic history. Contemporary educational systems could benefit from studying how these programs balanced practical skills with intellectual development. The concubine system's history also offers cautionary lessons about informal power arrangements that lack adequate legal protections and democratic accountability. While some concubines achieved remarkable success, the system's informal nature made it vulnerable to abuse in ways that democratic institutions with formal checks and balances are better equipped to prevent. Perhaps most importantly, the system's eventual collapse illustrates both the possibilities and limitations of gradual reform versus revolutionary change. The attempts to modernize Islamic societies, while preserving traditional institutions, largely failed because the underlying contradictions proved irreconcilable. This suggests that successful social transformation requires comprehensive approaches that address cultural assumptions and institutional arrangements simultaneously, that prepares individuals for leadership roles. The sophisticated training programs that developed within harem contexts have produced some of the most capable administrators and cultural leaders in Islamic history. Contemporary educational systems could benefit from studying how these programs balanced practical skills with intellectual development and cultural sophistication. Third, the system's integration of diverse backgrounds and its emphasis on merit-based advancement provide insights relevant to contemporary discussions about diversity, inclusion, and social mobility. The fact that women from various ethnic and cultural backgrounds could achieve positions of influence within Islamic courts suggests approaches to social integration that contemporary societies might adapt to address their own diversity challenges. The concubine system's history also offers cautionary lessons about the dangers of informal power arrangements that lack adequate legal protections and democratic accountability. While some concubines achieved remarkable success, the system's informal nature made it vulnerable to abuse and manipulation in ways that democratic institutions with formal checks and balances are better equipped to prevent. Perhaps most importantly, the system's eventual collapse illustrates both the possibilities and limitations of gradual reform versus revolutionary change. The attempts to modernize Islamic societies while preserving traditional institutions largely failed because the underlying contradictions proved irreconcilable. This suggests that successful social transformation requires comprehensive approaches that address cultural assumptions and institutional arrangements simultaneously, rather than attempting to change laws while leaving deeper structures intact. The ongoing debates about the concubine system's legacy also highlight the importance of developing historical narratives that acknowledge both achievements and problems without falling into either uncritical nostalgia or simplistic condemnation. Contemporary Islamic societies need approaches to their history that recognize the genuine accomplishments of classical Islamic civilization while honestly confronting the limitations and injustices of traditional arrangements. Finally, the concubine system's history demonstrates that institutional arrangements must evolve to meet changing circumstances and values. The challenge for contemporary societies is developing approaches to change that preserve valuable elements of traditional culture while addressing legitimate demands for equality, justice, and human dignity. The concubine system's complex legacy suggests that this balance is difficult to achieve, but essential for creating societies that honor their past while meeting their present obligations. Looking back across the 1,000-year sweep of the concubine system in medieval Islam, we've witnessed one of history's most complex and contradictory institutions, a system that simultaneously represented remarkable opportunities for women's advancement and deeply problematic arrangements based on slavery and legal inequality. Our journey has taken us from the sophisticated legal frameworks that govern these relationships through the educational programs that produce some of history's most capable female leaders, to the dramatic political crises that demonstrated both the system's potential and its ultimate limitations. The most surprising discovery may be how different the reality was from our modern assumptions. Far from being simply exotic harems filled with passive women, these institutions functioned as sophisticated centers of education, cultural development, and political influence. The concubines we've encountered, from Shajar al-Durr ruling Egypt during the Crusades to Harem Sultan reshaping Ottoman succession politics, were not victims of circumstances but active agents who used the opportunities available to them to achieve remarkable success within their historical contexts. The key patterns that emerge throughout our exploration reveal the system's fundamental complexity. We've seen how Islamic legal principles created protections and pathways to freedom that distinguished this institution from slavery in other societies, while also acknowledging that these protections were often inadequate and irregularly enforced. We've explored how sophisticated educational programs produced women who could manage complex administrative responsibilities, conduct diplomatic negotiations, and influence major political decisions, while recognizing that these opportunities came at the cost of personal freedom and legal equality. The evolution we've traced shows how the system adapted to changing circumstances over centuries, becoming more systematized and elaborate in empires like the Ottoman state, while maintaining its essential character as a pathway for social mobility within hierarchical societies. The dramatic conflicts we've examined, particularly the Ottoman succession crisis that eliminated Prince Mustafa, revealed how the system could be manipulated by ambitious individuals in ways that violated its own principles and ultimately contributed to political instability. Perhaps most importantly, we've discovered how the system's abolition in the modern period involved both genuine progress toward human rights and equality, and the loss of certain opportunities and protections that had benefited some women. The complex legacy we've explored continues to influence contemporary Islamic societies in ways that aren't always obvious, but nonetheless shape ongoing debates about women's roles, cultural authenticity, and social organization. The transformation we've witnessed from a functioning if problematic institution to a historical memory that influences modern discussions illustrates broader themes about how societies change, how traditional institutions adapt or disappear, and how historical legacies shape contemporary possibilities. The concubine system's history offers no simple lessons or easy moral judgments, but it provides valuable insights into the challenges of creating societies that balance individual opportunity with collective stability, cultural continuity with social justice, and historical wisdom with contemporary values. Throughout our journey, we've also seen how this institution influenced the development of Islamic civilization in ways that extended far beyond the palace walls. The educational methods, legal frameworks, cultural practices, and political strategies that emerged from the concubine system shaped Islamic approaches to governance, social organization, and international relations for centuries. The diplomatic networks, commercial relationships, and cultural exchanges that developed around these institutions contributed to the Islamic world's position as a center of global civilization during the medieval period. The most striking pattern that has emerged is how the system simultaneously empowered and constrained the women who participated in it, while providing unprecedented opportunities for social advancement, cultural development, and political influence. It also reinforced fundamental inequalities and dependencies that limited genuine autonomy. This contradiction reflects broader tensions within all societies between individual freedom and collective stability, between protecting the vulnerable and enabling the capable, between preserving tradition and embracing change. How understanding has evolved throughout our journey reflects the complexity of studying institutions that don't fit neatly into modern categories of analysis. The concubine system was neither entirely oppressive nor entirely liberating. It was a human institution that reflected the possibilities and limitations of its time, while creating patterns that continue to influence the world we live in today. Let me leave you with one final story that encapsulates the broader themes we've explored throughout this journey. The tale of Hafsa Sultan, a woman whose lifespan bridges the height of the concubine system and the beginning of its transformation, whose experiences reveal both the remarkable possibilities and the tragic limitations that characterize this complex institution. Born sometime around 1479 in the Crimean Peninsula, Hafsa began life as the daughter of a Crimean Tatar noble family before being captured during one of the frequent raids that swept across the Black Sea region. Sold in the slave markets of Kaffa, she was eventually brought to the Ottoman court as a young woman, where her intelligence and beauty caught the attention of Prince Selim, the future Sultan Selim I. What makes her story particularly compelling is how it demonstrates the full arc of possibility within the concubine system. She received a comprehensive education that was typical for promising palace women, learning Turkish, Arabic, and Persian, studying Islamic law and theology, mastering the complex protocols of court life, and developing the cultural sophistication that would later make her an effective political operator. When she bore Prince Selim a son in 1494, the future Sultan, Suleiman the Magnificent, her status was transformed according to Islamic law. She became an walid, a mother of a prince, with legal protections that guaranteed her security and status. But Hafsa's story reveals the system's complexities beyond simple advancement. When her master became Sultan Selim I in 1512, she found herself navigating the dangerous politics of succession that would shape the Ottoman Empire for centuries. Her son Suleiman had several half-brothers whose mothers were also competing for influence, creating the kind of factional conflicts that we've seen throughout our exploration. She had to use all the skills she'd learned, diplomatic, administrative, and political, to protect her son's position and ensure his eventual succession. Her success was remarkable. When Suleiman became Sultan in 1520, Hafsa became the lead Sultan, the Queen Mother, one of the most powerful positions in the Ottoman state. She managed the imperial harem, influenced major policy decisions, and served as regent when her son was away on military campaigns. The Haseki Sultan complex she built in Istanbul stands today as a testament to her wealth and influence, a massive architectural achievement that included a mosque, a madrasa, a hospital, and charitable kitchens that fed thousands of people daily. Yet her story also reveals the system's ultimate contradictions. Despite achieving extraordinary power and influence, she remained legally a former slave whose status depended entirely on her relationship to the men in her life. When she died in 1534, her authority died with her, and the succession struggles she had tried to prevent eventually erupted in the conflicts between her son's wives and concubines that we explored earlier. Perhaps most poignantly, Hafsa lived long enough to see the beginning of the changes that would eventually transform the system entirely. The increasing European pressure on the Ottoman Empire, the growing influence of new ideas about governance and social organization, and the internal contradictions that her own success had helped create were all becoming visible during her lifetime. She represented both the pinnacle of what the concubine system could achieve and the beginning of its eventual obsolescence. Her story reminds us that history is made by individual human beings making choices within the constraints and opportunities of their times. She wasn't just a symbol of an institution or a victim of historical forces. She was a person who used her intelligence, determination, and the opportunities available to her to create a life of meaning and influence within a system that was both enabling and constraining. What it reveals about the broader narrative we've explored is that the concubine system was fundamentally about human agency, the ways that people, even in constrained circumstances, find paths to dignity, influence, and achievement. That such paths existed within a system based on slavery and inequality doesn't justify the system, but it does remind us that human creativity and resilience can create meaning and opportunity even in imperfect circumstances. The stories we've encountered throughout our journey also highlight the importance of understanding historical institutions within their own contexts rather than judging them solely by contemporary standards. This doesn't mean accepting or excusing practices that violated human dignity, but it does mean recognizing that people in the past faced different constraints and opportunities than we do today. The remarkable women we've met, from Shajar al-Durr to Kaysaran to Egg Hafsa, made choices within the systems available to them, often achieving extraordinary success, despite significant limitations. Their experiences also remind us that progress isn't always linear, and that the abolition of problematic institutions doesn't automatically create better alternatives. The collapse of the concubine system eliminated many injustices, but it also removed certain opportunities and protections that had benefited some women. Contemporary Islamic societies continue to grapple with finding arrangements that provide genuine equality while honoring cultural values and historical legacies. The global implications of this history extend far beyond Islamic world. The concubine system's sophisticated approaches to education, cultural integration, and social mobility offer insights relevant to contemporary discussions about diversity, inclusion, and opportunity in all societies. The ways that capable individuals from marginalized backgrounds could achieve positions of real influence within traditional Islamic institutions provide historical precedents for modern efforts to create more equitable and inclusive societies. The system's ultimate failure also provides important lessons about the limitations of reform and the necessity of fundamental change when institutional arrangements become incompatible with evolving values and circumstances. The attempts to preserve elements of the concubine system while adapting to modern conditions largely failed because the underlying contradictions proved irreconcilable. This suggests that sustainable social progress requires comprehensive transformation rather than superficial modifications done at the same time. The loss of certain positive elements when the system collapsed reminds us that change always involves trade-offs and that preserving valuable aspects of traditional institutions while eliminating problematic elements requires careful thought and planning. The sophisticated educational approaches, cultural integration methods, and social mobility pathways that had characterized the concubine system at its best were largely lost during the modernization process, leaving gaps that contemporary societies are still struggling to fill. The women whose stories have shaped our journey, from the powerful rulers who influenced the course of empires to the anonymous figures who found dignity and purpose within palace walls, represent the full spectrum of human experience within constrained circumstances. Their successes and failures, their achievements and limitations, their triumphs and tragedies remind us that history is always about individual human beings making choices within the opportunities and constraints of their times, perhaps most importantly. Their stories challenge us to think more deeply about the relationship between individual agency and structural inequality, between cultural tradition and social justice, between historical understanding and contemporary action. The concubine system's history offers no simple answers to these challenges, but it does provide valuable perspectives on how societies have attempted to balance competing values and interests across time and culture. As we reach the end of our exploration, it's worth taking a moment to reflect on what this journey has revealed about both the past we've studied and the present we inhabit. The concubine system in medieval Islam was neither the exotic fantasy that popular imagination often creates, nor the simple story of oppression that modern moral frameworks might suggest. It was a human institution with all the complexity, contradiction, and moral ambiguity that characterizes human attempts to organize society and create opportunities for flourishing within the constraints of their times. The women whose stories we've shared, from the remarkable rulers who shaped empires to the anonymous figures who found dignity and purpose within palace walls, remind us that history is always more complex than our categories suggest. Their experiences offer no easy lessons for our contemporary challenges, but they do provide insights into the enduring human struggles to balance individual aspiration with collective stability, cultural continuity with social justice, and historical wisdom with contemporary values. Perhaps the most important thing we can take from this exploration is an appreciation for the complexity of human experience across time and culture. The medieval Islamic world that created and sustained the concubine system was neither entirely admirable nor entirely condemnable. It was a civilization that achieved remarkable things while also perpetuating serious injustices that created unprecedented opportunities for some while constraining others, that developed sophisticated approaches to human problems while remaining bound by the limitations of its historical context. As you continue your own journey through history and life, may you carry with you this appreciation for complexity, this willingness to see human experience in all its contradictory richness, and this understanding that every age, including our own, represents both unprecedented possibilities and persistent limitations. The stories we've shared tonight are now part of your own understanding, adding their voices to the ongoing human conversation about how we can live together with dignity, justice, and meaning. Thank you for joining me on this journey through time. Sleep well and dream of the complexity and richness of human experience across the centuries.